Welcome back. All right, so a few years back, I did a video on Boston and Montreal on the rivalry between these teams, and I feel like we're in the centennial season for Boston. Why not do an updated look at it? Boston and Montreal have a very long history against one another. I did a series where I looked at each season in the NHL's history, and it really became a talking point of Boston Montreal's a bad matchup for Boston because it was. And traditionally, Montreal has kind of stolen Boston's lunch money. And when we look at it in the Stanley Cup final, these teams have met each other multiple times. Boston never won a Stanley Cup final against the Montreal Canadiens. So 1930, the teams meet in the Stanley Cup final for the first time. Boston had an amazing season. 875 was their points percentage, and they lost 2-0 against the Montreal Canadiens. In fact, that being a sweep is the reason why the NHL made it a best-of-5 series from then on. The thought process being, well, that was over kind of quick, and yep, that would be. And so a great season for Boston went by the wayside, something that has never happened again. All right, 1946. Boston has an overtime win in Game 4. That was the only win they had in the series against Montreal. It was a 4-1 series win for the Montreal Canadiens. So 16 years later, same story. 1953. Dick Irvin Sr., the coach of the Montreal Canadiens, decides, you know what, I'm going to do something different. After Game 2, he replaces Jacques Plante, Hall of Famer, with Jerry McNeil, and it works. They win the series in 5, 4-1 over Boston because Boston-Montreal's a bad matchup for Boston and because Dick Irvin was a good coach. 1957, the Habs win 4-1. Boston managed 6 goals in the entire series. So that's 4 now. Boston with a grand total of 3 wins in those 4 series. 1958, so a year later, things are a little bit better. It's a 4-2 series for Montreal. However, Rocket Richard gave Boston's defense fits. 11 goals by Rocket Richard in the Stanley Cup final in that 6-game series. So Rocket Richard beat the Boston Bruins that year 4-2. And then it's not until 1977 before we see these teams meet in the Stanley Cup final again. The Habs swept the series. Boston had a lead in the first period of Game 4, though. So there you go. 1978, Montreal won 4-2, and they clinched the Stanley Cup at the Boston Garden. So a little extra humiliation for Boston fans. And then for people who are wondering where, well, remember 1979, that was in the semifinal. And I wanted to mention that here because it is the most famous play in this rivalry, and it was too many men on the ice for the Boston Bruins. Don Cherry behind the coach. Too many men call with 2 minutes and 34 seconds left in the third period of Game 7 of the Stanley Cup semifinal. And Boston led 4-3. Montreal scores on the power play, and then they scored in overtime. They won the series and went on to win the Stanley Cup final against the New York Rangers. Otherwise, we would have had Boston and the New York Rangers, and who knows, maybe the Rangers would have beaten Boston and we wouldn't have been talking about 1940 in the 80s and early 90s. But at any rate, Montreal wins that one. The too many men call is still talked about to this day. Here I am talking about it. And I had to mention that here, even though it's not a Stanley Cup final. Now, in the regular season, Montreal has, again, been dominant. 364 wins, 281 losses, 114 ties, or overtime and shootout losses. So Montreal's been better there. And in the playoffs, Montreal has bested Boston 106 wins to 71 wins. So, yeah, this rivalry's been very lopsided. Now, for me personally, where I come in as a fan is 1984. So up until then, they hadn't met while I was watching hockey. But this is where when people get, I'm sick of these teams playing each other in the playoffs all the time. Oh, the 80s. The 80s were really and truly a decade where we saw teams play each other all the time. And honestly, I never once complained. I never had a problem that Montreal and Boston played every year. And it seemed like it was the first round every year. I looked forward to it. I thought it was going to be great. Now, 1984, Montreal wins 3-0. Steve Penney went on quite the run that year. Pete Peters was the goaltender for Boston in that series. 1985, Montreal wins in 5, 3-2. So again, these are both first-round matchups. It's Steve Penney again. He wins over Keynes and Peters, split the net for the Boston Bruins in that series. 1986, Montreal sweeps again. This time it's another new goaltender, Patrick Roy. And at the other end, you had Ranford and Riggin. So Bill Ranford, goaltender for the Boston Bruins, he's about to get traded in exchange for Andy Moog, and that's where things change. 1987, Montreal wins 4 straight. So another sweep for Montreal. It is Roy in the net for Montreal, of course. Keynes and Ranford in net for the Boston Bruins, who again would then go out and get Andy Moog. And in 1988, Andy Moog, Reggie Lemelin, Boston wins 4-1. That was considered remarkable, and that was the first year that I was really and truly cheering for Boston. I'd been leaning towards them before that, but yeah, I really went into it with Boston that year. It's Lemelin and Moog, my favorite goaltending tandem, I think, ever, if I had to rank my favorite goaltending tandems. And at the other end, it was Roy and Hayward. So Patrick Roy and Brian Hayward split in the net there. Hayward was good for Montreal for a large stretch there. 1989, Montreal gets their revenge, 4-1 again, this time Montreal winning it. It's Roy and Hayward, the goalies of record for Montreal, who would win the Cup that year. Lemelin and Moog, again, goalies of record for the Boston Bruins. So this is in an era where, yeah, goalies would split the net. It wasn't considered a big deal. 1990, the splitting of the net is done. Boston wins 4-1. It's Andy Moog's net at one end. It's Patrick Roy's at the other. So one of the reasons why, you know, when I talk about Andy Moog and I talk about his overall stats and his accomplishments, and I still say I'd love to see him in the Hall of Fame someday, he bested Patrick Roy 3 years in a row. 1991, Boston wins 4-3. Again, it's Moog over Roy. 1992, Boston wins 4 straight to win that series. And again, it's Moog versus Roy. So it was a good time for me as a Boston Bruins fan. For my dad as a Montreal fan, less good. And the one that I remember was, I believe it was 1988, where Boston knocked off Montreal. And my dad and I had a very spirited discussion about Andy Moog and pushing the net off. If you're a Montreal fan, you would likely remember that incident. Puck was going to go in, so Moog just turns around and knocks the net off. And I turned to my dad and I said, that was really smart, because that was just before the puck went in. Of course, it should have been a penalty, and that led to the spirited discussion. And I just kept saying, I just think it's really smart. I don't know where the puck is. Knock the net off. So that was the end of the meeting every single year, kind of. They didn't meet in 1993, but they meet again in 1994. Boston won that series 4-3. It was Roy and Tugnut in the net for Montreal. And at the other end, Casey and Riondo. So a bit of a surprise in that one, but yeah, overall, let me double check something. Yeah, I just had the goalies in the wrong order. I was trying to put the winning goalie on the left, losing goalie on the right. Boston did win that one in 7. I just had the Montreal goalies first. I'm like, wait a minute. Boston won that series. Yeah, Boston won that series. So that's 5 out of 6 series won by Boston after I became a Bruins fan. So you're welcome. But then things start to change. So since then, in 2002, Montreal wins in 6 against the Boston Bruins. Jose Theodore had a really good year that year. He was the winning goalie against Defoe. 2004, they meet again. Montreal wins that year 4-3. That was a frustrating playoffs for me. Vancouver loses in 7 against Calgary. Boston loses in 7 against Montreal. So I get to watch as the hated rivals of the teams that I cheer for go on and win and move along. But in that series, it's Theodore versus Raycroft. Andrew Raycroft's one, I believe that's the one playoff appearance he had for the Boston Bruins was that season. 2008, Montreal wins in 7 that year. It's Carey Price versus Tim Thomas. 2009, the teams meet again. This time, Boston sweeps them. That was the most fun I've ever had watching a Boston-Montreal series. I would imagine it was less fun for Montreal. Thomas versus Price in that series. 2011, Boston wins in 7. So it's the opposite of 2004, where Boston beats Montreal in overtime in Game 7. Vancouver beats Chicago in overtime in Game 7 of 2011. So both teams beat hated rivals in Game 7s that year. It's the reverse of 2004. But yeah, it's Thomas versus Price there, and of course Boston won the Cup in 2011. So on 2 occasions where these teams have met each other in the time I've watched them, the winning team went on to win the Stanley Cup. 2014, Montreal wins. This is the most recent matchup between the two teams in the playoffs. That was a 7-game series where Price beat Rask. But it was a lot of fun to watch because, hey, you know, anytime these teams meet, it's good. And this is part of the reason why. When I talk about the Montreal Canadiens, I'm rooting for them to get back into the playoff hunt because these teams have so many matchups against each other, and some kind of a matchup between Boston and Montreal. Even though traditionally it's been a bad matchup for Boston, I'm there for it. I want to watch it. And recent history, 4 of the last 6 meetings have been won by Montreal. So even though there's this nice stretch from 88 to 94, generally speaking, it's gone towards Montreal. And the regular season, there's some notables here. The 1944-45 season, Montreal won all 10 games against the Boston Bruins. So Boston had to be kind of tired of seeing them because that's 44-45. That's the original 6 era. And so you're seeing teams a lot. Again, this is why people are like, I'm tired of these teams playing against each other. All I think is, oh, youngins, you have no idea how much you can get tired of seeing a team if you see them 8 or more times per season, especially if it was over a shorter season. I would imagine that was tough. 59-60 through 61-62, Montreal versus Boston. Montreal had 30 wins, 9 losses, and 3 ties. Montreal really did a very good job of beating the Boston Bruins. 81-82, the Habs went 7-0-1 against Boston, and they enjoyed it so much they did it again in 88-89, where they met 8 times. 2007-2008, Montreal won all 8 matchups versus the Boston Bruins. So, regular season-wise, it all checks out. Montreal has definitely been the better team in this rivalry. But since 2017-2018, there has been a shift towards Boston. They are 17-2-2 versus Montreal since 2017-2018, and this season they're 1-0-1 against Montreal. So they have 2 more games left against Montreal this season. We'll see how those go. But again, if Montreal somehow sneaks into a playoff spot and ends up against Boston, I'm there for it. Even if Montreal ended up beating Boston, which has happened, and I've watched it happen, and as tough as it is to watch, I want to see them play each other again. I want to see Montreal bring their best. I want to see Boston bring their best. I want to see a 7-game series. And I wouldn't mind seeing that this coming spring, too, if we can get that to happen. So it is an interesting way that I look at it in that, yeah, I'm obviously going to cheer for Boston against Montreal, but I love seeing Montreal against Boston, even though traditionally it has not been a series that has favored the Boston Bruins. So there you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below, as always. And if this video does well, I will discuss other rivalries in hockey. I'm doing this differently than I did the rivalry videos 3.5 years ago. And so, yeah, we'll see whether or not this video does well. And if it does, yep, you'll see other rivalries as well. So like Battle of Alberta, Montreal versus Toronto, that kind of thing. But let me know your thoughts. Hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video or just because you feel like it. Thank you guys so much for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.